Welcome everyone to session 3 of our 12th annual Marine Money London Virtual Ship Finance Forum. It's great to have you all with us. There's a lot of people listening in, several hundred people from all over the world, and it's great that we're able to take this opportunity to meet in this way and to discuss the big issues affecting shipping at this moment. We've already had 2 sessions today, and in each of those sessions ESG was mentioned and discussed. It really is probably the hottest topic in shipping these days, and it gets discussed in all events, and it's appropriate that we have a panel at our London event dedicated to ESG, and it's the title of the session is ESG Impacts All Shipping Stakeholders. Just before we begin, I'd like to advise that the audience can ask questions. Questions can be asked by writing them in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen, in that little red area down there. Those questions will come to me, and at the end of the session, I will then select 2 or 3 of those questions and ask the audience on your behalf. One other thing I'd like to point out, that to the right of your screen again, you'll see the handouts. In that handout section, there are a couple of PDF files about Marine Money, but also a couple more from some of our sponsors and speakers. A lot of useful information, and there are various handouts in each of the sessions today. Our speaker, first of all, is Lindsey Keeble, Partner and Global Maritime Sector Head of Watson, Farley and Williams. Watson, Farley and Williams did a very large ESG survey amongst the shipping industry, and Lindsey is going to give us some comments on the findings of that survey, and thereafter she'll be the moderator of the session. And with that, Lindsey, I'll pass it over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Kevin, and thanks to Marine Money for giving WFW the opportunity to moderate today's ESG panel. As Kevin said, ESG is at the forefront of the mind of everybody in the industry, so we're pleased to be able to share some of the initial results from the survey which WFW carried out in the autumn last year on the key issues facing the maritime industry. The full report will be launched on the 24th of February, and we're really pleased with the results that we received. We had over 545 responses from senior executives within the industry, and also we included 10 in-depth panel interviews, including with some of our panelists that are joining us today. As you can see from the slide, we had a wide sort of response, 44% from ship owners and from financiers, and we also received charter input from across the industry. As well as touching a broad cross-section of sectors, also geographically, we had a good geographical spread reaching from the Americas, EMEA, and also Asia Pacific, and we have the ability to break down the results across the region and across the subsectors. Turning to one of the main questions which we asked, the challenges facing the industry today, it will be no surprise to anybody that number 1 is reducing emissions amongst both the ship owner community and the financiers. Joint second for ship owners was also the black swan events such as the COVID pandemic that we're facing, as well as trade tensions and including sanctions in that. So they're also clearly at the forefront of people's minds. Looking to the ESG factors, in terms of ESG factors, again, emissions top the survey across the broad range of ESG issues that are facing the industry. And this was the same for both financiers and for the ship owners. Whereas topics like financial reporting and diversity targets, which are more towards the social and governance elements, they seem to be more issues at the forefront of the minds of the financing community. This slide sums up the key findings for us across all of the whole of the survey. Some of these we can explore in a bit more detail with our panelists, but mainly they relate to how sort of new technology will be financed and how to balance the issues of being a first mover when turning to address the ESG issues. When looking at ways to finance the transition, I think that it became quite clear that there were some very mixed results about how this should be achieved, but there was a recognition among ship owners that there's a greater need for collaboration. In addition, across the board, people are looking to governments and to fund the research and development into ESG. But I think what became quite clear was that ESG is definitely here to stay. It's on the agenda, not just for today, but for the longer term. So I'm delighted to be able to explore some of these topics with our panelists today. So maybe if the panelists would like to join us on the virtual stage. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Good morning.
Just to introduce who's joining me today here on the panel, we have Paul Taylor, who's Global Head of Shipping and Offshore at Societe Generale, Øystein Kalleklev, who is the Managing Chief Executive Officer at Flex LNG, Michael Labuskes, who is a Senior Director, Aviation, Transportation and Commercial Finance at Kroll, Kristin Holth, who is a board member of both Maersk Tankers and of Gaslog. And also we have, last but not least, Julian Proctor from EnTrust. So welcome, everybody. We're going to go through the questions today. We're also going to put up some polling questions on the screen. So maybe we can put the first one up. And I think it would be very good to hear the feedback from the audience as well as we go through this. So the first poll question, and we'll carry on talking, but and we'll come back to your results as we go. But Kristin, maybe turning first to you, I think it's perhaps no surprise, given the regulatory changes and the global focus on CO2 emissions, that reducing emissions was the #1 priority for the maritime industry. How important do you think that voluntary initiatives such as the Getting to Zero Coalition and Poseidon Principles and the Sea Cargo Charter have been and how do we maintain this momentum?
Thank you, Lindsey. I think we all know by now that the task we have ahead is so daunting. So we really need all the initiatives. And what we know is they come from different angles, different collaboration, different focus. We need all hands on deck because this is such a challenge. And the important part is we go all in the same direction. And I think capital has been and is quite important in this aspect. It's an influencer in a way. And as you mentioned, the Poseidon Principle, this was really the right time, an initiative which was so taken by interest by the whole industry and by the financial industry. And by now we have more than 20 banks with more than $150 billion in portfolio, also now with Asian banks. And actually now in January, we had the first time the annual disclosure of the bank's portfolio and how they are aligned. So this will shows that it will have an impact on how the banks and the financials make their decisions and business decisions going forward. And what we so from that perspective, we do see the initiatives are working in the right direction. And if you look at some of the other capital, because it's not just about the lending, it's also about the bonds and about the equity investors. And we have seen so far quite a few loan agreements has been sustainability linked in one way or another. What we now also see that we see a sustainability linking from bond. And we saw last week 2 bonds being issued by Seaspan and by Offshore, which actually my previous employer was Corin, which was the first bonds to the industry, which was sustainability linked. So I would say, yes, the initiatives are working. They are crucial. They go in the same direction. So this ball is just rolling.
Yeah, and Paul, you saw it flash up there. So even though we have the voluntary initiatives, 91% of people think that we need regulation to change. So I suppose that's in line with the Poseidon Principles, that you're following regulation anyway.
I think yes, we need. Sorry.
No, I think if you're asking me why there's such disparity between the figures, if that's your question, I think that is probably to be expected at this stage, and it probably shows the huge role, as Kristin said, that banks have to play in the energy transition, and these voluntary initiatives are super crucial, and they complement the framework that's set by regulation. But if you look at why we have such disparity in the figures, so it was 90% banks saying ESG was important and 20 something percent of ship owners. I think that's to be predicted, because you've got the banks. ESG is a huge role in banks' raison d'etre at the moment. It's deep rooted in our values. It's within our conduct and culture ever since the financial crisis. So we've had a long time to build these values up, and they're absolutely central to, I think, almost any bank's business model going forwards. You've got responsibility, accountability, transparency at the heart of everything we now do, which is really crucial. And we're agile. We can sort of change our tactics as such. And I don't think that's the same for ship owners. They don't have the same agility. They don't have the same regulation that banks have at the moment. They are still several years sort of behind, I think, having that regulatory pressure. But what you do have is investment in long life assets. And when you invest in a long life asset, you're looking for 25, 30 years of life, and you lose the agility to move. So ship owners are not going to be able to put ESG straight away at the heart of their business model unless there's a real financial driver to all investment decisions. But if you ask the same question in 5 years' time, that disparity will be much closer.
Yes, I think you're referring, Kroll, aren't you? Because I think when we did our survey, we said that 29% of owners said that it barely influences their decisions, whereas 90% of financiers. I do think, like you say, that it's going to come round a bit more. But Kristin, you thought just then popping up on the survey results that 91% need regulation to drive the change. So I think that's still at the heart of the way forward, I suppose.
I think both are so important, and yes, if IMO hadn't been very ambitious in their target, we wouldn't have been having the same discussion. So yes, you need the regulators to be ambitious and to set really the stage. But I would also say that the ship owners or the industry is moving so fast. So what they said or what we heard half a year or 6 months ago has already changed. Many see this also as a competitive edge, that they will really, the climate actions open up for market share gains by the actions they take. So I think we see a very, very speedy process also within the ship owning industry.
Øystein, maybe moving across to you as the ship owner on the panel, although there's sort of widespread agreement with the need to reduce emissions, I think there's still a lot more uncertainty of sort of how we're going to get there. Would you place sort of more emphasis on the new technology, or also sort of the operational efficiency of your fleet?
No, I think the simple and rather uninspiring answer is that we actually need to focus on both of those things. Despite what some are claiming, there are really no silver bullet available today that solves the cocktail of technical, operational, financial and environmental requirements. So in terms of fuel, the best available fuel today is LNG, but building ships with LNG propulsion is associated with added capex, and ship owners will not do this unless they see a clear economic benefit from doing this extra investment. And the reality is that we need to pull a lot of different levers to make improvements. This relates to how we operate our ships, how we design ships or new ships. This is what we call the EEDI, as well as potentially adding energy-saving devices to existing ships and thereby improving their EEXI. So, for LNG industry in general, we are in the fortunate situation that we have seen a revolution in propulsion technology last 10 years or so. So LNG ships have gone from being a lagger in the industry in terms of efficiency to now being the leader in the industry with dual-fuel two-stroke propulsion. So in that sense, I think we moved very quickly in LNG, and actually this 70% reduction in energy or carbon intensity that the IMO is targeting, we are able to almost achieve this today in 2021 with the new ships.
What do you think could be done to address these concerns over being sort of the first mover for ship owners, especially if not everyone's playing to the same ESG rules, so to speak? If one the first mover that's going to create the new ways.
Yeah, I think a much simpler system would surely help. Political leaders have been unable to implement a global carbon tax, which is the preferred solution by almost everybody. Instead, they have tried to solve the problem with a spaghetti of global regulation and regional regulation like the EU. And this regulation is extremely detailed and complex, and the cost of doing it this way is probably less visible, but for the end consumer, it's much higher. So I would rather prefer that EU and US now under a Biden administration and other big nations like Japan and China agreeing a global carbon tax with annual increase in this tax. And I think this coupled with a border adjustment tax for those countries not willing to join would be a much better system. And under such a system, the market would solve the problem of greenhouse gas emission. And I much prefer that companies thrive and die at the invisible hand of the market rather than at the visible and arbitrary hand of regulators. So, but of course, this is a good system for lawyers and big companies with a lot of lobbying power. But these companies tend to rather want to preserve the status quo.
Yeah. Julian, maybe
Lindsey,
yeah.
I'd just like to maybe react to what Øystein said, because I think there's, again, if you look at that regulated response with a lot of people saying that regulators should take a bigger role, I do think that historically the IMO has been slow. I think we would all recognize it could definitely be faster, but I do think that two things. One, there's a really important role that regional regulators like the EU can play. Because if you think about what happened in the aviation industry, or what happened with the sulfur directive, or some other regional regulations which eventually globalized, how did it start? It started because you had a regional regulator which took up that leadership position and really drove global change. And I think in a similar way, when you think about the leadership that the EU is taking on carbon, now, surely we'd like in an ideal world to have the silver bullet solution of a global IMO, but to get there, I suspect you need to have players, whether or not it's the state of California, whether or not it's the EU, which creates those pressures on China, Japan, and other IMO members to ultimately create the change. So I think there's a super important role for regional regulators. People are probably a little bit tired at the slow speed of IMO change. And probably there's also an underappreciation for the customer response. I think what we've seen in the last 24 months has been a phenomenal change with how end users ultimately think about their emissions. And I think that's probably just maybe it's an information issue. There's not enough disclosure, not enough appreciation within the industry. But the big end users, the Amazons, the Walmarts, the Shells, they have fundamentally changed the way they report, disclose emission levels, and what they require ultimately from their freight providers. So I think it's a balance of a number of things, but again, I want to underline the importance of regional regulators.
I think it comes down to the point that Kevin made at the start. It is for all stakeholders along the way to play their part, isn't it? And the end user should not be ignored in that, and us as consumers as well at the end of the day. But maybe Julian, continuing with you, I think it's been reported it's about 1.4 trillion needed to decarbonise the shipping industry, which does require a huge amount of R&D and a huge amount of investment. Do you see a role for the institutional investors to fund new technology?
There's definitely several $1 trillion of capital expenditures required to decarbonise the industry, and banks like the one that Kristin used to run and Paul does run today, they're major players in providing the debt finance component of that CapEx. The challenge that I'm more concerned about is the material equity hole, because as you probably know, there's a number of increasingly environmentally and socially focused asset managers, asset owners, the pension plans and foundations, which really are super focused on the impacts and the alignment of their portfolios on these issues. So to attract that type of institutional capital increasingly requires the businesses, whether it's equity or fixed income, to be climatically aligned. And to the extent that those portfolio investments are not, there's going to be more and more pressure either for those businesses to change what they do, or for, as you've probably seen in many other cases, divestment strategies, or for much more direct corporate activism to change how these businesses perform. And I think we're increasingly seeing that. You probably saw there was a large mining company, I won't name who it was, last year, for the first time had a climate plan, which was announced in August of 2020. And that was because of a lot of corporate activism from a very large Australian asset manager, which had been focusing on that issue for several years. So I definitely think there's a big need for equity capital, but ultimately the business models are going to have to adjust, and the operations of these businesses are going to have to adjust. As it relates to, I think your other part of your question really was related more to growth capital. So venture capital, risk-taking capital. I think that's a much smaller pool of capital today. The good news is there's markets like Norway which have a lot of appetite for that earlier stage capital, and they're doing some phenomenal things. I think if you were to look at sort of what are the most exciting technological developments occurring in terms of new, whether or not it's carbon capture, whether or not it's on hydrogen electrolyzers, new battery technologies, Norway is financing a large part of that, and probably many of the other markets need to catch up. But there's a hole. There's very clearly a hole. It's a very small amount of equity capital. But I think the bigger, broader picture, what does the institutional equity capital come from to decarbonize the industry? The owners, the operators need to make some very fundamental changes to their business models, because the capital is not going to come otherwise.
Yes, it's not just the E, is it? It's also, we've always focused on the E so far, I think, in shipping, but the social and the governance, you know, in order to attract that capital, you're really going to need to focus on those elements as well.
Well, you just saw the World Economic Forum last week. There was a few big announcements which came out. One was from Jeff Bezos and his backing with a big focus on decarbonization. The second was really on social well-being of crew, which was the Neptune agreement, which came out. There's a large number of signatories. Crew well-being is massively underappreciated. You know, companies like Øystein are doing a phenomenal job in that regard. But I think it's something which is going to increasingly become much more mainstream. There'll be a much bigger focus on these welfare issues going forward, for sure.
Michael, maybe I'm bringing you into the conversation from the rating agency point of view. What role do you see the rating agents being able to play with shipping companies accessing the capital markets, and what kind of products do you envisage being able to make available?
Thanks. We have been seeing, and it seems to be an increase in the looking to access capital markets rather than strictly bank financing in this space. Some of the banks have pulled back and either gotten out of the business or reduced their platforms, and that leaves a vacuum where you get into more of the capital markets. And this is, well, this has been a bit of a private market generally in shipping. The investors often, certain segments of them require ratings, and so that's been increasing our space and what we've been seeing and what the footprints have been. And it's also been expanding what sort of things we're being asked to look at. Historically, it was a lot of plain vanilla single vessel financings, some shipping companies, and that's been growing. The number of shipping companies that we look at, as well as the types of financing for vessels. And that's again, the investors are the ones that are looking for the ratings, and it leads itself to the cost of financing for the companies. So they have choices. They can decide where to go. There's, you know, at the right price, there's money available, and going the route, you know, with a rating can save that. And with, you know, seeing it was mentioned earlier, sustainability linked bonds, that's we expect that to grow substantially. With C-SPAN, I think was the first one we had a rating on that, and we expect more in that space.
Maybe we'll bring up another poll question, but while we carry on chatting, I think this relates back to what Julian was saying about sort of more corporate governance and transparency. But Kristin as well, touching on something Julian said, I mean, our survey showed that there was a limited appetite from the usual ship finance banks to allow the sort of new technology to share in the vessel security? And if this is the case, and using ships to kind of secure your investment, I suppose where do you see this other funding coming from? Or do you think that lenders need to be a bit more flexible to allow ship owners to use the asset, the collateral that they have in the asset, to help fund transition?
I think it's Julian touched upon or showed the breadth of what you need to capture the necessary financing. This is a broad base. It's not like one source of funding. But let me answer it a bit differently. Normally, you do not finance a ship. You finance a company, except if there is a long charter. So you finance a company which you think has a good business model, and you finance the cash flow of the company, or the future cash flow of the company. So you make an evaluation of, do they have a good business model? Do they have a solid balance sheet? And is it a future winner and takes ESG seriously? Do they reduce their footprints? Do they have the technology so it is for the future? All these aspects is part of the evaluation you make. So, and then you do corporate lending. You lend to the company. How they use the capital is not what you necessarily look into as such. You look at what kind of company do you have as a partner. And in that, you will see those with the most solid business model, those which do have good R&D, which look at the future, design, propulsion, the fuel, those who look at being a future winner. That's the company that will get the funding from being a bank or from bonds or from the equity investor. So I think it's and if you have the sound balance sheet, you will be able to do that. If not, banks normally do not finance R&D; they finance companies.
Yeah, I suppose.
Ultimately, Lindsey, if I may just step in there, I do agree with Kristin on what she says. But when you look at retrofits of vessels for the energy transition, I do see. I mean, the issue you've raised about there being less banks available for unsecured finance for this type of retrofit. It's true, and I think that is largely going to continue across the industry, despite the fact that, of course, we'll look at the company's cash flows. If you look at the way the scrubbers have been financed for IMO 2020, there's been a lot of export finance business financing those, and that clearly could still be one angle for some of the retrofits, depending on what type of equipment is being retrofitted, such as sails, for example, would be one option or one example. And then, of course, also I think there could be a developing leasing market. There's been all sorts of small to middle ticket leasing programs over the years that start very small and scale upwards, and there's certainly scalability in this. So I would expect a leasing market to develop, not necessarily with equipment security, but sometimes with security. But that could well develop into a very large business in the years ahead.
I suppose that comes down to more coming out of the OPEX rather than being secured necessarily by the, on the ship itself. So I suppose that might make people feel a bit more relaxed about it if you're leasing it rather. Paul, maybe continuing with you. I don't know if people are as aware as they need to be, but the EU taxonomy that's coming through is going to cover the maritime space as well. How do you see the ability of the typical ship finance banks in the EU to continue to finance the industry, and how do we ensure as ship owners, and maybe Øystein wants to chip in, that the industry doesn't have regimes imposed upon it which are just simply not workable?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really key topic. Fortunately it's still at the working party level, and no decisions have been sort of made. Nothing in writing as such a cast in stone. But I'm quite concerned about it. It's crucial that the working parties have more dialogue with those individuals who are in day-to-day commercial and financial operations within the sector, and not just with policymakers. We need clear rules, and at the moment I don't really think I know anyone who really understands the rules. We need clear regulatory rules that work for everybody, and what we really need is a set of rules that embrace the transitionary period that we will be going through for the next 10 years probably. And the way the EU taxonomy is drafted at the moment, it really it's very unclear as to whether fuels like LNG, even in a biofuel form, will actually have a role to play. And by role to play, we're talking about whether we're going to get green certification. Now, why is that important? The reason is, or the answer is, that going forward, investors in this industry need green certification. So maybe Julian will come in later, but for institutional investors, they're going to need a rating, and they need a green rating, just like with credit ratings. With a green rating or a transitional rating incorporating LNG, we're going to encourage significant investment in the shipping sector that will drive the energy transition. With banks, if it includes the likes of LNG and the transitional period, we're going to get cheaper pricing for the industry, because the capital charge will be lower for banks, and it can be transferred to the clients. That's the positive. The negative is if we try to be green overnight and exclude LNG or exclude existing ships which have carbon capture equipment or other ways in terms of extending the alignment runway of that ship on AER, unless we have ways in which we can include them in a reduced EEOI or AER to get this certification, we're going to drive investment away from this market, both in the capital markets, and also we're going to make banks uncompetitive, and banks will apply their capital elsewhere. So in its worst sense, we're going to push back the energy transition in shipping, because investment will be driven to other industries. So what we really need is clarity from the EU and acknowledgement and embracement of the transitionary period that is crucial to this whole transition.
And you can't get from here to there overnight, so you need to support the journey. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Anyone else want to chip in on that one?
I totally agree with Paul. It seems like we have gone from the energy transition to the energy switch. So it's a bit of, and if you look at the EU taxonomy, there's no base load being, so it's only intermittent energy which is part of the EU taxonomy as it looks today. And so how the hell are you going to run the grid without any base load? So nuclear is not part of the mix, even though you don't have any CO2 emissions from nuclear. And it's in the future, it will certainly be the best way to make hydrogen. And you don't have LNG. So if you look at the UK, so in 2013, when they introduced the carbon tax, coal was 40% market share. Today, coal is virtually zero, and renewables is 40%. So it's basically switched from coal to the renewables in a very short time frame without having any taxonomy. The only way this happened was because you have a carbon tax. But when you're getting renewable share to 40%, when you have a lot of wind and sun, that market share goes up to 65–70%. But suddenly, when there's not that lot of sun or wind, that share plummet to 20% or less. And this has happened. In last winter, you had 8 days where the grid in UK had less than 20% market share for 8 days in a row. And how are you going to provide capacity then? How are you going to ensure enough electricity if none of the baseload power sources are part of the EU taxonomy? So I think, there's people who are a bit eager to push for something a bit too early and not really thinking about the implications.
Maybe I could just, I think I wouldn't go as far as to say people aren't thinking about this. I mean, the Energy Transition Commission in the UK is spending a fair amount of time with some relatively bright minds thinking through a lot of baseload issues. So I would probably take issue with that. I would also say that there's much more investments going into hydrogen electrolyzers and the green hydrogen economy and maybe the blue hydrogen economy and ammonia than we're probably giving credit for. So 10 years is a long time, 15 years is an even longer time. We've seen what's happened to the cost of offshore wind. We've seen what's happened to the cost of PV in 8 years, the cost of batteries in 8 years. I think these are changes which are happening, as Kristin said at the beginning, at a pace unforeseen before in history. So I think we have to be open-minded to the fact that we could have very different baseload conditions in 2030, 2035 than what we have today. That would be my first point. The second point relates a little bit to what Paul was saying on certification of institutional equity. And I think with regards to To that is certainly an area which is of increasing concern amongst large asset owners and asset managers. They are very focused on as I mentioned before, the climate alignment of the portfolios. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean they will have equity certification, but it does mean that many of the consultants which they depend on in terms of asset allocation issues will be increasingly focused on these issues. So the consultants will have an increasingly large role to play. And I would also say disclosure. One thing I hear from big asset owners is, how do you disclose? Do you have the right data? Can you verify that data? Can you disclose your data in a way which we can use in a meaningful way? So this means much more focus on things such as the SASB, the Task Force on Climate Disclosures, as well as specific disclosures related to climate alignment, carbon emissions. These are going to become really important items.
Yes, Kristin. Yeah.
Yes, a comment to that. I agree fully with all the comments there, and I think it's underestimated the importance of this aspect, because it's going so fast, and the decision in the EU can have effect by the end of the year without really making maybe the necessary evaluation of the consequences for the transportation sector. We're talking about 85 shipping is representing 85% of the transport in the world, so it's poor. But obviously, this will have an impact on the capital and the cost of capital. And then maybe if you will not manage to really capture this in a good way, it will have a very high impact on the cost. The cost for equity or any funding cost will have an impact. That will again may have an impact on the business model you can have. And to look at to the comment before from Julian, if you just saw the letter that BlackRock was sending out last night to CEOs, how hard they go into what they expect from the companies they invest in. Either they withdraw investments or where they invest. And there's no companies, he says, whose business model is not profoundly changed by the transition to net zero economy. So, I mean, it's coming from all fronts that you have to look into. That's why I go back to the question you have initially, that all ship owners were 29%. They have this in their mind when they make decisions. This has to change so fast.
Michael, maybe you've heard here that I think there's a concern over conflicting requirements from different bodies. I mean, if you have ESG criteria for rating agencies, how do you see that they will interweave with all the regulatory frameworks out there?
Yeah, so at KBRA, we view our core mission. It always has been and always will be assessment of default and recovery. And so really we look at credit, and the credit aspects that fit into ESG, regardless of the outside regulations on it, there's relatively few that directly impact credit, and most of these we've always been looking at and we've always been incorporating into our analysis. We're just calling them by a bit of a different name now. And yeah, so we unlike some of our competitors, we're not moving towards a score-based system. Speaking with investors extensively, we don't think that our opinion that we need to create a value-based ESG scoring rubric, that it muddies the water. It's burdensome on the companies that we look at. It's burdensome on the investors to sift through that data. When at the end of the day, it's not credit relevant. Now, that being said, ESG is very important to us, but we look at it through ESG management. And so from a risk management standpoint, what are the managers of the company? What are they looking at? What have they identified? What are their stakeholders' preferences? And how is that going to impact things? So that can be a credit impact because of all the things that have been said related to the cost of financing. If you're ignoring something that is coming at you really fast, and then Are you going to be able to refinance that debt that's due in 2 years? Is it going to impact your liquidity significantly? And are you going to lose your investors so that your cost of debt goes up very high, or maybe you can't even achieve the issuance that you need? So that's sort of how we're fitting into it.
So it's more about how the ESG pressures outside are going to impact the ability of the company's performance on an ongoing basis.
Exactly.
And I think, Lindsey, that's also the way banks are looking at it. It's not just to do the right thing, and there's clearly a large aspect of that, but there's a very strong risk management aspect of ESG, or of the E, certainly in our risk decisions. So bringing climate alignment into credit decisions through the Poseidon principles, yes, that's sort of new, but actually how the ESG impacts the risk aspects of the company and the transaction is something which banks have always been looking at, and will be looking at probably even more going forward.
Yeah. Julian, maybe turning to an area sort of in your expertise again. So we've been involved with quite a lot of M&A activity in the last quarter of 2020, and it's still ongoing now. So I suppose, do you see a bigger role for institutional money coming into the M&A space as sort of equity rather than sort of debt?
I think it's happening in large amounts in certain parts of the ocean industries, right? So if you look at sustainable fisheries, there's been a lot of institutional interest over there. A number of French infrastructure funds have recently acquired some leading live well carrier businesses like Salttrans, Aqua. You also see in the ferry space a huge amount of institutional interest. But all these businesses, they have something in common, right? Which is, on the one hand, in fisheries, there's a huge link between low carbon protein, which is what fish is, and how that gets positioned vis-a-vis more high carbon intensive meat, right? And many people think about these larger themes. I think as it relates to industrial shipping being the other, let me pause. Offshore wind, you will absolutely see anybody who's associated with the marine aspect of offshore wind will see an enormous amount of institutional interest. If you go further towards industrial shipping, the interest gets harder. And I think the onus becomes increasingly on the owner and the operator to show how they're going to align with these future demand trends. So what is company A if they happen to be moving high carbon molecules as opposed to low carbon molecules in the future? What are they doing to capture those benefits? Are they better positioned to carry complex cargoes in a very safe way? And if you can do, then probably you're going to find a lot more institutional interest. I think they're the trends which are developing, and they're developing at a very high speed. And I think those people which can't show, the ship owners and the ship operators which can't show that they can make that transition to those high growth, high decarbonization aligned cargo sectors, it's going to get a lot tougher.
Øystein, turning back to you, it's quite clear that you're a fan of carbon credits. But do you think that ship owners can rightly expect governments to sort of use taxpayer funds to fund the transition, or do you think it's more on end users, charterers to share some of this burden of the cost?
I think the companies, they are better able to fund the energy transition than politicians, and the carbon taxation will then act as the carrot and the stick. And hopefully these companies are able then to pass on the cost through the value chain, so that in the end it's the end consumer forking the bill for the the cost associated with the emission reduction. At least that's how it works in theory. So I think a carbon tax is a simple, predictable, efficient system. And the only problem is that too few industries are part of it. And if shipping was part of our global carbon tax system, I think decarbonization would take off in a similar fashion as we've seen for coal in Europe, both in UK and in the European Union. the companies like us with efficient ship who have already done the leap, we will then be rewarded, while those people with the inefficient ships, they will not only have ships which are technically obsolete, but also financially so.
Maybe we can bring up our last poll question while I ask maybe a final question to all of you. How confident are you that the industry will meet the ESG targets over the next decade, and what do you see as the major barrier to achieving the results that we need? Maybe kick off with you, Kristin.
Thank you, Lindsey. Yes, I have no doubt. I mean, we're talking about 2030 and 2050. And if you look 10 years back and see what we have achieved in those 10 years, I'm not at all hesitant to what we can achieve the next 10 years. And we have so many sticks and carrots now. We have to do this. And to access capital, you need to do this. So, and if you see all the R&D and all the proposals, all the corporations across industries, it's not just about shipping, it's about any industry. And the cooperation across this industry and cross fertilizing, there's so many there's so many projects on the table. Some will develop, some will not. So no, I'm not at all hesitant to say that I'm confident. But yes, it takes time, but we will get there.
Paul?
Yeah, I see the result of the poll disagrees with Kristin.
That's fine.
I agree with Kristin. I think there's real momentum shown by the industry over the last decade, certainly on the E part of ESG. Little bit less so on S and G. G is coming with transparency, responsibility, etc. On the social side, clearly a lot of work still needs to take place on the scrapping side of shipping, and that really has to happen going forwards. But overall, I am positive. I think the challenges are that we need an ecosystem collaboration across the industry, on a global scale, rather than this sort of winner takes all mentality and what's in it for me mentality that has gripped the shipping industry for decades. That is key, and I think we're beginning to see it with initiatives like Getting to Zero and Poseidon Principles, and also the Sea Cargo Charter. We need clear regulation, as I mentioned, embracing a transitional period. That has to be the case to access capital, if nothing else. And we have to find a way of de-risking first movers, because I don't think it's just a shipping company's role. I think they need finance, they need a charter. We have to have a common responsibility.
Michael?
Yeah, I agree as well with Paul and Kristin, not the poll results. I'd be very shocked if they aren't met in these, which are fairly long time frames. I do hope that the regulations as they develop, that they're not too prescriptive, that prohibit some of the innovation that we hear about every day with new developments. It's hard to tell at this stage what exactly is going to be the best, what's going to stick. So sort of an all of the above process right now is hopefully the way that we can continue to make progress.
Øystein, you're a glass half full or a glass half empty guy?
No, I think I agree with Paul. We have made a lot of effort and improvements, especially on the E, maybe less so in the industry in general for the S and G. I think if you look at the handouts here, you can look at the 2019 Flex LNG ESG report, which is made according to SASB system, the Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, which Michael Bloomberg founded. So I think, a lot of these companies are publishing their ESG reports, there's more transparency. I think where there's a lot of work to be done is on the G. And the chairman of Hunter Group, Arne Fredli, he said before Christmas that 60 to 80% of listed shipping companies are a fraud. And I don't disagree much with him. I think maybe the range is high. maybe it should be 50 to 70% instead. And I think there's a lot of listed public shipping companies who are run for the benefit of managers instead of shareholders, especially related to related party transaction, various fee schemes and such. So I think this is one of the big problems in the shipping industry, making it investable. And I would really like that banks would put as much focus on the G as they do on the E, in order to make sure that the company they are funding with debt are also being run in a shareholder friendly way, to make sure that all stakeholders get what they deserve.
And Julian, a final word from you.
You know, I love what Øystein said about governance, and I applaud him for that, because it's massively important. What I would say in terms of the poll, I'm surprised. I would have thought they would be supporting the 6 of us here on the panel, because all you have to do is look at the global aspirations of China: 2060 net zero, Japan 2050 net zero, Korea 2050 net zero. The list goes on. Europe 55% reductions by 2030. You have the Biden administration with a multi-trillion-dollar climate action plan. There is trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars at national and supranational levels going in to solve the environmental challenge. Number two, you look at just about every Fortune 500 company, they all have net zero carbon strategies, which means they're going one way. And shipping is just part of the supply chain. We happen to be an important part of their scope 3 emissions, which they have to report on. So the bottom line is we have to clean up, because if they don't choose company A ships, they'll choose company B ships. Then you've got people like Paul and Kristin's old bank, super focused on debt capital. You got people like me. This is what we focus on, and there's another $50 trillion of ESG related assets which are doing the same. So to me, there's an inevitability about what is happening. I think we're being under aspirational. I think it's going to happen way faster than we think.
That's a good positive final word. Thank you. I'll hand over to Kevin, who I think may be posing some questions from the audience.
Yep, thank you very much for the discussion so far. One question which has come in, we saw the poll question. The first poll question was, we need lots more regulation. The question is, will the regulation come from within or from outside the industry? I don't know, Paul, Kristin, you might like to comment on that, please.
Well, sorry, I can start off. My belief is that the regulation will start from within the industry. I think, you know, it's there. We don't need much more regulation. We need clearer regulation, and I think the regulation is there in a working draft, which is, in my opinion, not clear, and my opinion needs to be more embracing of the transitionary period. I won't go into that again. So I think it's there already. It'll come from within the sector, and I don't think we need too much meddling from outside.
Yeah, I agree with Paul that it's mostly from the inside, but also from the outside. If you look at the taxonomy, it is really coming from EU, so it's from outside the industry, and that's part of the problem, because they don't really adapt it perfectly to the industry. But the requirements is also coming from investors, so don't underestimate the effect of their requirement or the impact that will have.
Okay, thanks. Question for Øystein, and perhaps Julian, you might like to comment. Do you think companies which are focused on ESG are being positively supported by the capital markets? For example, is there enough investor differentiation between one company and another?
I think today it's more about it's becoming a requirement. So if you want to be in the capital markets, if you want to attract capital, this is both equity, bond, as some mentioned here with sustainable linked bonds, but also bank debt. You know, we did a 639 million bank loan here, which we signed February last year, and also, so altogether we've done $1.7 billion of debt the last 2.5 years or so. And of course we have implemented the Poseidon principle, and I think it's more about getting actually access to capital. So first step, I think, you know, you need to tick some boxes to be there, and then I think, where are you getting rewarded for being ESG compliant? That is more a question I'm more hesitant about saying yes to. Of course, there are some companies being priced ridiculously on the stock exchange because of ESG focus and retail investors, but for the shipping industry, I don't really see a lot of listed shipping companies being priced like a bubble. It's more related to tech and other sectors. So yes, I think it's a requirement. It's becoming more important, surely, and kind of the ESG requirements we are meeting, they are getting a bit more stringent every year. And we applaud and we like this development. We think it's nice that we differentiate in a greater extent between different companies, so that those people who are willing to make commitment to build efficient ships and to run the companies in a fair way for all the shareholders and stakeholders, that they are rewarded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would add to what Øystein said, which is, I think it depends. To your first question, is there a premium? We did a lot of work about a year and a bit ago across various sectors, industrial sectors, automotives, power companies, energy companies, and there was clearly a value differential between the top quartile and lower quartile in terms of various environmental scores. The markets were clearly attaching a premium to those businesses which had more environmentally centric business models. It was very clear in the data. I think as it relates to the marine space, again, I get back to that differentiation between industrial shipping and the rest of the ocean industries. If you look at ferry companies which are clean, they're going at massive valuations, right? If you look at offshore wind businesses today, massive valuations. And it's the same in the sustainable fishery space as well, very big valuations. If you look at industrial shipping, it's different. And a large part of that, we've got to take some of the responsibility. We probably haven't done a good enough job in communicating what we're doing to align ourselves with decarbonization. Because people will always ask, if we look at the future energy mix, look at any of the IEA scenarios, and you look at what happens to some of the high carbon molecules, demand gets low. And the natural question comes, well, shouldn't we be supporting the carriers of cargoes which are more aligned with a low carbon future, which you can do in some of the other sectors that I mentioned. So I think this is the challenge that we need to do as an industry, a heavy part of industrial shipping industry, if we want to get more attractive valuations.
Okay, thank you. Another question, how can we've mentioned the amount of investment that's going to be required, and it's massive, it's trillions of dollars. The question is, how can an industry that hasn't really earned its cost of capital for over a decade possibly achieve the energy transition that we're all saying has to happen over the next 10 years? I mean, how is it physically going to be able to sort of pay for all of this? I don't know, Paul, maybe a comment?
Thank you, Kevin.
I hope the answer is that rates needs to go up.
No, I think what I would agree with the question that this is an industry that hasn't made a profit for as a single sector for a decade, so it shouldn't be that attractive in many ways to institutional investor market, but actually it is. There's plenty of capital out there looking for the right projects. There's plenty of bank capital there looking for the right projects. So the capital is there. It's just that it is harder to find which projects, which companies to support going forwards. And there's no doubt that it's those companies that will take a lead role in the energy transition, which will get the confidence, I think, of the investors, of the banks, of the institutional investors, who can actually take a lead role in the market rather than be followers. That we do need the help of the regulator. As I said earlier on, if we don't get the help from regulation, that will drive some of the investment away from this sector. But with some help, I personally believe that the investment is there across the industry.
Okay, and that leads into another question we've had. I mean, you mentioned, the leaders in the industry will get this finance, and I think that's, we know that the leading companies have always been able to access finance. But those leading companies are how many? 40, 50, 60, 70 in the world. And there are hundreds of other shipping companies, small shipping companies owning 1 or 2 or 3 ships, new ships, old ships, all kinds of, it's a very, very diverse industry. How are the rest going to be able to make it? And is perhaps ESG the death knell at the end of the day of the small ship owner? I don't know, Kristin, Julian, anybody?
I can give some comment to that. I think this is not just applicable for this industry, to be honest. It's for all industries, and you have startups and you have smaller companies and medium, and maybe shipping have had maybe still too diversified. Maybe this is part of what means you need to consolidate, because you need a bigger balance sheet to be able to have the R&D focus. You need to be able to change and to be part of the transition. So I think it's a way of finding the right partner and finding the good business model. So access to capital, going back to that, will eventually be more driving towards those who are able to reduce the footprints, to have a future model. So it's a tough one. It's a really tough one for the smaller industries.
I think I agree. I think there's a flight to quality. We're already seeing it. My bank has always looked to what we call the top tier companies, but there have been plenty of other banks that have worked higher up the sort of risk chain, and we're now seeing them in the space which we're in. So there is definitely a flight to quality, and I can see that extending as we go through this transitional period. So I do have a fear for maybe the smaller private ship owner, and that's where I think institutional third-party alternative capital comes into play. It might be at a higher cost, but that is probably where it can be sourced.
Kevin, maybe just add to your point, because I think they join, which is, you mentioned, why is the industry being structurally unprofitable? And what does this mean for a fragmented industry? I think part of the reason that the profitability in certain sectors of shipping, certainly the medium and smaller size, has been under a lot of pressure. You've had too many players, right? And as those customer pressures become more acute, certainly on the bigger side of shipping, which are really focused on these environmental and social considerations, this is going to drive out those players which can't meet those standards of safely and transparently moving cargo. So I suspect this is a bit of a shakeout of the industry, which ultimately will lead to a rising of industry profitability, I would hope, because we haven't been earning our capital for the last several years.
Okay, perfect. We're out of time, I'm afraid. It's been a fantastic discussion, and thank you all very much. Lindsey, Paul, Øystein, Michael, Kristin, and Julian, thank you very much for that discussion on ESG impacting all shipping stakeholders. We're now going to have a break again. We'll reconvene at 4 p.m. London time, and our topic then will be shipping finance in 2021 and beyond. So for now, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.